You held royal babies, but never your own. That's the twisted core of this whole story. People love to romanticize the past, but being a wet nurse? It was straight-up emotional brutality wrapped in a fancy title. On paper, it looked like a golden ticket. Serve the nobles, feed their precious heirs, live in a big house. But the reality hit like a brick. You only got that job because you were poor, desperate, and had milk to give. Just not to your own child. Imagine giving birth, your body wired to protect and feed the tiny human you just brought into the world. And then, before you even get to hold them for more than a moment, someone tells you your milk is needed elsewhere. Not for your baby. For a richer one. A more important one. And if you refuse, your family starves. You don't really get a choice. Society had already made that decision for you. So you pack your things, kiss a newborn goodbye, and walk into a strange household where your worth gets reduced to one thing: how well you can feed someone else's child. The nobles look at you like an asset, not a mother. Their midwives examine you like livestock. Your diet gets regulated. Your sleep gets monitored. Every part of your life bends around keeping that milk flowing. You're not allowed to go home. You're barely allowed to write letters. Your body belongs to them now. Meanwhile, your own baby, left behind with whoever is available. Maybe a grandmother, maybe a neighbor, maybe no one reliable at all. Infant mortality was already brutal back then. Without their mother's milk, the odds tanked even harder. And you knew that. You carried that fear every single day, but couldn't do a damn thing about it. And the nobles act like they're doing you a favor. Feeding a future lord or princess is supposed to be this amazing honor, like you should feel grateful to sacrifice your own child for theirs. They don't see the heartbreak. They don't see the nights you cry alone because your breasts are nourishing a stranger while your own kid might be starving miles away. But here's the darkest part. The job forces you to bond with the noble baby. You spend months, sometimes years, feeding them, soothing them, holding them closer than their actual mother does. It messes with your head. Your instincts tell you, this is your baby now. But the second the child is weaned, you're out. No goodbye. No gratitude, no future. Just an empty crib, an empty home waiting for you, and maybe an empty grave where your child should have grown up. That's the brutal truth behind the so-called honor of being a wet nurse. A job built on poverty, gender inequality, and emotional sacrifice so deep it barely gets mentioned in the history books. But their stories matter, and we're digging into all of it. The pain, the politics, the class divide, and the silent suffering that powered the households of the rich. Let's break down just how messed up the system was, because it didn't happen by accident. Society engineered this whole thing. In medieval Europe, and honestly way beyond that, wealthy families treated breastfeeding like something beneath them. Noble women were expected to stay pale, delicate, untouched by anything messy or animalistic. Breastfeeding could change a woman's body, drain her energy, maybe even affect her social obligations. So instead of nursing their own children, they outsourced motherhood to the poor. Wet nurses weren't hired because they were amazing with kids. They were hired because their body was currently producing milk. That's it. Their entire value was biological. Think less employee and more walking milk machine. And the contracts? Brutal. A wet nurse had to promise she wouldn't get pregnant again, because pregnancy could slow down milk production. So her employer basically controlled her sex life too. If her milk supply dropped, she could be punished or fired. Fired meant no money. No money meant going back to poverty with a child who might not have survived. And the physical strain? Wild. Breastfeeding one infant around the clock is demanding. Breastfeeding another woman's infant under strict supervision, while dealing with grief and stress, is torture. Stress can affect milk production, so wet nurses had to stay calm, obedient, well-fed. At least well-fed enough to keep giving good milk. They were constantly monitored. You couldn't sneak home. You couldn't check on your own baby. You couldn't even show too much affection to the noble child, because noble families were paranoid about their kids bonding with the help. Meanwhile, the noble baby grows attached. They know your smell, your heartbeat, your voice. You become their comfort, their literal lifeline. But you're still disposable. The moment the kid starts eating solid food, or the noble mother wants to take over for appearances, done. You're dismissed like a tool that's no longer needed. And when you do finally go home, you're not returning to the same baby you left. If your child survived, they don't know you. They grew up without your smell, your heartbeat, your warmth. The bond was severed before it even began. Mothers talked about coming home to children who didn't recognize their faces, who cried when touched, who clung to someone else instead. Talk about a punch to the gut. Some wet nurses tried to rebel quietly, sneaking letters, begging for permission to visit home, trying to nurse their own babies in secret. But the system was built to make that almost impossible. Your milk was a commodity. Your grief was irrelevant. Your child's life was collateral damage. And the craziest part? Nobles acted like this was totally normal. They wrote etiquette guides praising wet nurses for their service, while completely ignoring the suffering they caused. Wet nursing wasn't portrayed as emotional labor. It was painted as a duty, a privilege for the poor. Like, congratulations, you get to save the ruling class while your own family pays the price. The more you dig into it, the more you see it. This wasn't motherhood. It was exploitation packaged as tradition. And the women at the center of it had almost no voice, no agency, and no chance to escape the cycle. Now, let's zoom in on the living conditions, because this is where things get even darker. When a wet nurse took the job, she didn't just clock in and out. She moved into the noble household full-time. And that environment? It wasn't cozy or nurturing. It was surveillance disguised as service. Your room was usually tiny, close to the nursery, so you could be summoned at any hour. Privacy? Forget it. You were expected to be available day and night. No excuses, no fatigue, no humanity. Your diet was controlled like you were livestock. They fed you what they thought made better milk, which was often less about nutrition and more about superstition. Some households stuffed their wet nurses with wine and bread because they believed it fortified the milk. Others restricted food because they thought richer milk made babies too fussy. You weren't allowed to choose what you ate. You weren't allowed to eat when you wanted. Your body was basically under contract. And the rules? Ridiculously strict. You couldn't cry, get stressed, or show grief. Anything that might spoil your milk. If your mood dropped, midwives blamed you. If the baby got sick, they blamed you. If your breasts hurt or got infected, you were still expected to nurse. There was no break, no medical care, no empathy. Mastitis, cracked nipples, bleeding. You powered through it all because stopping meant losing the job. Noble families also treated you like someone who needed constant supervision. Some had older women assigned to watch you 24/7, to make sure you weren't secretly nursing your own baby, stealing food, or contaminating the noble child with poor habits. They literally policed your behavior to maintain class boundaries. And let's not pretend the nobles were bonding with their kids either. Many upper-class mothers barely interacted with their newborns during this period. You were the one doing the feeding, the soothing, the singing, the comforting. You handled the midnight cries. You kept the child calm when they were teething. You taught them how to hold on, how to breathe steady, how to sleep. All the things people say build the strongest mother-child connection. You were doing that, but you weren't allowed to own any of it. And that's where the emotional damage hits hardest. You weren't just feeding a noble baby. You were raising them in their most fragile years. You were pouring love, energy, and maternal instinct into a child who wasn't yours, while being forbidden from loving your own. That split reality messed with women on a deep psychological level. You're bonding with a kid who will grow up to call you nothing. You're missing your own child's first laugh, first teeth, first words. Those moments don't come back. Some wet nurses wrote that the worst part wasn't leaving their child. It was coming back. walking into a home where the baby didn't recognize them. Or worse, finding out the child hadn't survived. Imagine carrying that weight while nobles thanked each other for their good judgment in hiring you. This wasn't a job, it was a slow, controlled unraveling of motherhood itself. When you look at the bigger picture, the whole system exposes exactly how brutal class power really was. Wet nursing wasn't created out of love or community or some wholesome women helping women vibe. It existed because the rich wanted the benefits of motherhood without the inconvenience, and the poor had no leverage to say no. It was a pipeline built on inequality. Rich babies got fed, poor babies got risked, and society pretended it was all perfectly normal. And here's the kicker. Wet nurses weren't even guaranteed stability after sacrificing everything. Once the noble baby was weaned, your job ended instantly. No long-term contract, no safety net, no thank you for keeping my heir alive. Most wet nurses returned home to the same poverty they came from, except now they carried the emotional scars of two lost bonds. The child they had raised but couldn't keep, and the child they had birthed but couldn't raise. The long-term psychological damage? Basically ignored by historians for centuries. You don't get to find diaries full of raw emotions from these women, because most of them couldn't read or write. Their pain lived in silence. The only hints we have come from medical records, stray letters, and the complaints noble families wrote about their wet nurses. And even then, the humanity bleeds through the cracks. A midwife mentioning a wet nurse crying alone. A noblewoman annoyed that the nurse kept asking about her own child. A doctor warning that grief could spoil the milk. The suffering is there, hiding between the lines. But here's what makes their story worth telling now. Wet nurses kept the entire social hierarchy functioning. They were the invisible foundation under noble lineages. Future kings, future queens, future lords, all of them survived because some poor woman gave up her own baby's chance so theirs could live. And society still treated them like footnotes, disposable, replaceable, forgotten. When we talk about motherhood, labour, and exploitation, wet nurses are the definition of uncredited emotional labour. Their bodies were used, their love was redirected, their grief was ignored, and their names never made it into the family histories they helped secure. So let's call it what it was. Not an honour, not a privilege, but one of the harshest, most emotionally violent jobs in history. A job born from inequality. A job that tore families apart. A job wrapped in silence for centuries. And the next time someone romanticizes the old days, remember this. Behind every royal portrait of a healthy baby, there was a woman who paid the price with pieces of her own heart.